The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 1. The Brownstone That Whispers, Brooklyn, NY. We never should have signed that lease. Looking back, everything about the deal felt too good to be true. A brownstone in Brooklyn, a fraction of the price of anything similar, and a landlord who seemed oddly eager to get the paperwork done. Old buildings have quirks, he had said. When we asked about the history, we didn't press for details. We were too excited, too blinded by the charm of the creaky wooden floors and intricate crown molding. We moved in on a crisp October afternoon, completely unaware that at 2:43 a.m. every single night, the house would start whispering. At first, we thought it was just the sounds of an old building settling, the faint murmurs drifting through. The hallways could have been pipes, the wind, or even a trick of our half-asleep minds. But soon we realized the whispers weren't random. They were conversations, distinct voices, low and steady, exchanging words we couldn't quite make out. And every night, without fail, it would begin at the exact same time, 2:43 a.m. Always. It took us a week to confirm that we weren't imagining things. The whispers never changed. Each night the same hushed voices spoke in the same order, their tone too deliberate to be the wind or creaking floorboards. We started staying up, listening more carefully, trying to pick out individual words. But they always hovered just out of reach, like a conversation happening in another room, muffled by a thick door. Repetition, precision. That's what unsettled me the most. It was as if we were hearing an old recording, replaying at the exact same time every night. Curiosity turned into unease. Why 2:43 a.m.? Why always the same words? And most importantly, who was speaking? We tried asking our neighbors if they'd ever heard anything unusual, but they just shrugged. "Old houses make noise," one of them said, almost too quickly. Another neighbor, an older woman, just stared at us for an uncomfortably long moment before mumbling, "You should break your lease." We laughed it off at the time. We shouldn't have. By the second week, our curiosity outweighed our fear. We decided to record the whispers. If we couldn't understand them with our own ears, maybe audio playback would help. At 2:40 a.m., we set up my phone on the hallway table, hit record, and went back to bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark, waiting. The house felt heavier, as if it knew what we were doing. At 2:43 a.m., the whispers began, soft, rhythmic, layered. My heart pounded as I strained to pick out a single word. But as always, the voices melted together into something just beyond comprehension. The next morning, we played the recording back. At first, it sounded just as we'd heard it. Distant, unintelligible murmurs, like a conversation happening on the other side of a wall. But then, a break in the pattern. A voice, lower and clearer than the others, speaking directly into the microphone. "This is not for you." My stomach turned to ice. We looked at each other in silence, the weight of those 4 words pressing against our chests. This wasn't just an echo of the past anymore. Something new we were listening. That night we couldn't sleep. The moment the clock struck 2:43 a.m., we lay frozen in bed, listening as the whispers resumed. Except this time, they were louder, closer. The murmurs no longer sounded like they were coming from the hallway, but from inside our bedroom walls. I held my breath, squeezing my wife's hand under the covers. Then, for the first time, the conversation shifted. A new voice, hoarse, deliberate, cut through the usual murmurs. "Stop recording." The whisper wasn't distant anymore. It was right next to my ear. I bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp, but before I could turn it on, the room fell silent. The air around us felt thick, charged with something unseen, something waiting. My wife sat up too, wide-eyed, gripping my arm. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. But neither of us moved. The brownstone had us trapped, not physically but psychologically. We didn't want to believe what was happening. We wanted a rational explanation. We wanted to pretend we hadn't just heard a voice inside our own room. The next day we avoided talking about it. It felt safer to pretend nothing had happened. But as night fell, the tension in the house became suffocating. Every creak of the old floors, every shift in the pipes sent jolts of fear through me. I suggested we sleep with the TV on, just to drown out the silence. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The whispers would come anyway, and they did. 2:43 a.m., sharp, but this time there was no buildup, no distant murmuring easing us into the nightmare. The voices were already there, already inside the room. The air turned icy. My breath came out in shaky clouds. Then, something new. A slow, deliberate inhale, like someone standing at the foot of our bed, watching, waiting. My wife clutched my arm so tightly her nails dug into my skin. Then a single word, clear as day, spoken in my own voice. Leave. We didn't wait for morning. We grabbed what we could, phones, wallets, keys, and bolted out of the brownstone, leaving everything else behind. The moment we stepped outside, the air felt lighter, like we had just escaped something that was never meant to let us go. We drove to a motel across town, sitting in silence, staring at the flickering neon sign outside our window. Neither of us slept. I kept checking my phone, watching the minutes crawl past 2:43 a.m. For the first time in weeks, there was only silence. The next day, we broke our lease. No explanations, no negotiations. We just wanted out. The landlord barely reacted, almost as if he expected it. We never went back for the rest of our things. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up with the feeling that something is still listening, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. And once, just once, I swore I heard it again. A whisper, my own voice, right next to my ear. This is not for you. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 2. Room 606, the Watergate Complex, Washington, D.C. I never believed in ghosts. I still don't. But I also can't explain what happened to me inside room 606. I'm a real estate agent. I've walked through abandoned homes, foreclosed, mansions and buildings left to rot for decades. I've felt the eerie silence of places no one should live in, but nothing ever got to me. Until Watergate. The request seems straightforward. Evaluate an old unit in the complex, untouched since the 1970s. A time capsule, they called it. The kind of property that should sell for millions based on history alone. But for some reason, no one wanted. Room 606. I arrived at the Watergate complex in the late afternoon. The lobby had the elegance of a bygone era, all marble and brass, but something about it felt still. The concierge barely looked at me as he handed over the key, muttering something under his breath that I didn't catch. The elevator ride was slow, the kind that hums and rattles just enough to remind you how old the building really is. When the door slid open on the 6th floor, the hallway was eerily quiet, the air heavy, as if no one had walked these halls in years. Room 606 was at the very end of the corridor. The brass numbers on the door were tarnished, dulled by time. When I inserted the key and turned the knob, the door resisted for a moment before groaning open. The apartment smelled of dust and something else, something damp. Odd, considering the unit had been unoccupied for decades. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Dead power. Sighing, I pulled out my phone's flashlight and stepped inside. The space was frozen in time. Yellowed wallpaper peeled at the edges, and a rotary phone sat untouched on a side table. A dust-covered couch faced a TV set that looked like it hadn't been turned on since Nixon's resignation. The air felt thick, unmoving. As I moved through the apartment, the wooden floor groaned beneath my feet, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then I noticed it, the bathroom mirror. It was fogged over as if someone had just taken a hot shower. That wasn't possible. The water had been shut off for decades. I reached out and wiped the glass with my sleeve. The condensation smeared, but didn't fully disappear. My stomach twisted as a thought surfaced. Had someone been here recently? I turned quickly, scanning the apartment, but I was alone. At least I thought I was. Shaking off the unease, I did what I came for. I took out my phone and started snapping pictures. The living room, the kitchen, the bedroom. Each shot illuminated the space in harsh, artificial light. The place was a relic, untouched yet somehow waiting. The mirror in the bathroom still bothered me, so I took one last photo of it before moving on. It wasn't until I stepped into the hallway that I decided to review the images. I scrolled through them absent-mindedly, checking angles and lighting. But when I reached the first picture, my breath hitched. There in the dim background, standing in the farthest corner of the living room, was a figure. Still, shadowed, watching. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen. The figure wasn't supposed to be there. I was alone. I knew I was alone. I flicked to the next image. The same figure. Closer. Not moving. Not blurred. Just nearer. My hands started to sweat as I flipped through each picture. Every time, the figure inched forward, always in the background, always just watching. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow, a distortion from my phone's lens. But then I reached the last photo, the one I had taken of the bathroom mirror. The fog had started to clear just enough to reveal something behind me. A shape, a face. And this time it wasn't standing in the background. It was right behind me. I spun around so fast that I nearly dropped my phone. The apartment was empty. The air was still heavy, thick with something unseen, but there was no one there. My pulse hammered in my ears as I took a shaky step backward, my eyes darting from corner to corner, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the room with me. My rational mind screamed for an explanation, an issue with the camera, a glitch, anything. But my gut told me otherwise. I needed to leave, now. My feet finally obeyed, carrying me toward the door, but as I reached for the handle I heard, a slow, deliberate creak from deep inside the apartment. The sound of weight shifting on old wooden floors. Not mine. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. My fingers fumbled with the lock, slick with sweat as another creak sounded, closer this time. My breath hitched. Finally, the door jerked open and I stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, heart pounding, listening, waiting. Nothing. But as I turned to leave, I glanced at my phone one last time. The photo of the mirror was still on the screen, but now the fog had fully cleared, and staring back at me from the glass was a figure, standing exactly where I had been moments ago. A figure with my height, my posture, my face. But the eyes weren't mine. They were staring through me, as if I had never really left room 606 at all. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 3. The Echoes Beneath, French Quarter, New Orleans, LA. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. But after what happened in New Orleans, I can't explain it any other way. We had rented a charming colonial-style house in the French Quarter, an Airbnb listing that boasted historic charm with modern amenities. The place had high ceilings, wrought iron balconies, and a strange, lingering scent of something burnt, though we chalked it up to the old wood. My friend Jason and I were in town for a week, ready to soak in the jazz, the food, and maybe even the ghost stories people love to tell. We just never expected to be part of one. That first night, after a long day of sightseeing and drinks, at a dive bar on Bourbon Street, we were settling into the creaky antique beds when we heard it. Soft, high-pitched giggles coming from below us. Jason paused mid-sentence, eyes flicking toward the floor. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I had. It was faint, but unmistakable. Children laughing. The problem? There was no below. The house had no basement. We tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was the neighbors, or the old pipes, shifting in the wooden foundation. But as we lay there in the dim glow of the street lamp, filtering through the lace curtains, the laughter came again. Closer this time. It wasn't playful anymore. It had a strange, hollow quality, as if echoing from a place much deeper than the floor beneath us. Jason sat up, rubbing his arms. "Man, that's really weird," he muttered. I agreed, but told him it was probably nothing. We turned up the volume on our phones, trying to drown out the unease with music. Eventually, exhaustion won, and we fell asleep. The next morning, the air in the house felt heavier. As we made coffee, Jason checked his phone. "Dude, look at this," he said, showing me a voice memo he had accidentally recorded the night before. It was mostly static, but beneath it faintly were the same childish giggles. My stomach twisted. We both knew we had heard something, but now there was proof. I tried to be rational. "Maybe it's an old recording, some kind of audio interference," I suggested, but I didn't believe it myself. Still, we had plans to explore the city, so we left the house, pushing the unease to the back of our minds. That night, the laughter returned. Only this time, it didn't stay below us. It moved. We had just turned off the lights when we heard it. Soft, breathy giggles, slipping through the cracks in the wooden floorboards, then faint tapping, as if small feet were running just beneath us. Jason shot up in bed. "Tell me you hear that," he whispered. I nodded, my pulse hammering in my ears. The giggling stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so thick it felt unnatural. We held our breath, waiting, and then a single creak, like the weight of something shifting. But the floor didn't just creak. It bowed slightly, as if something was pressing against it from underneath. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the wooden floorboards. Nothing. Just the old, uneven planks and a few dust motes swirling in the beam of light. "We should check outside," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a stupid idea, but staying inside felt worse. We crept to the front door, unlocked it as quietly as possible, and stepped onto the wrought iron balcony. The humid New Orleans night pressed against us, thick and heavy. The street below was empty, no kids, no movement. But as we stood there, trying to convince ourselves it was just our imagination, we heard it again, this time from inside the house. A whisper. 2 words, stretched out and breathy, like an exhale through the darkness. "Help me." We spun around. So fast, Jason nearly tripped over his own feet. The whisper had come from the living room, just past the doorway leading from the balcony. I hesitated before stepping inside, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something pulled me forward. Morbid curiosity, maybe, or the irrational need to prove to myself that we weren't losing our minds. The air inside the house felt different, colder, as if the night breeze hadn't touched it at all. Jason reached for the light switch, but the moment he flipped it, the bulb overhead shattered with a sharp pop, plunging the room into darkness. We stood frozen, hearts pounding. My phone flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows pooling in the corners of the room. "Screw this," Jason muttered, reaching for his duffel bag. "I'm not staying here another night." But as he zipped it open, a new sound made us both stop cold, a slow, rhythmic creaking. Not from the floor this time, but from the old wooden staircase leading to the upper level. Step by step, something was moving downward. Jason grabbed my wrist, his grip tight with fear. The steps stopped halfway, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. Silence. Then, barely above a whisper, a new sound. Shallow, raspy breathing. The breath was uneven, almost labored, as if whoever, or whatever was on the stairs was struggling to hold itself together. Jason took a slow step back, and I did the same, my hands clammy around my phone. I wanted to shine the light directly at the staircase, to see what was there. But a deeper part of me knew I didn't want to know. The air felt thick, oppressive, like we were being watched from every corner of the room. And then, just as suddenly, as it had started, the breathing stopped. Silence, but not the comfortable kind. The kind that makes your skin prickle, the kind that feels wrong. Then came the laughter again, but it was different now. Twisted, distorted. The sound of a child trying to mimic something else. It filled the room, bouncing off the walls, slipping between the cracks in the old wooden floor. And worse, this time. It wasn't coming from the stairs. It was all around us. Jason swore under his breath, grabbed his bag, and bolted for the door. I followed, not caring that we were leaving everything else behind. As I yanked the front door open, the laughter stopped. Dead silence. For a single, terrifying moment, I thought we had escaped. Then Jason gasped. "Your neck," he whispered. I reached up, my fingers brushing against my skin. It felt raw, sensitive. I pulled out my phone and flipped the camera to selfie mode, my pulse hammering. And that's when I saw them. Small, soot-stained handprints pressed around my throat. My breath hitched. The marks were faint but unmistakable, like a child's hands had gripped me while I slept. Jason looked just as horrified as I felt. "We need to go," he muttered, his voice barely more than a breath. We didn't waste another second. We ran. Out the door, down the empty street, not stopping until we reached the nearest hotel. We didn't talk about it, not then. Not when we booked another room. Not when we lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for laughter that thankfully never came. But before we left New Orleans, I looked up the history of that house. It was built over the ruins of an orphanage that had burned down in the late 1800s. The fire had spread so quickly that many of the children never made it out. Some were found near the basement, clawing at the floorboards, trying to escape. That last detail made my stomach turn. The children hadn't been laughing. They had been screaming. The thought of them, trapped beneath the floor, their final moments filled with terror, made the house's eerie sounds suddenly make sense. The giggles weren't playful. They were echoes of something much darker, something left behind. And the whispers? The hands around my throat? Maybe they weren't trying to hurt me. Maybe they were trying to show me how they had died. We never went back to that house. Never told the Airbnb host what happened. Who would believe us? But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still think about that last whisper. Help me. And I wonder, was it just a memory of their suffering? Or was someone still there beneath those floorboards, waiting for someone else to listen? The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 4. The Apartment That Calls Your Name, Chicago, IL, Magnificent Mile. I never thought I'd find a place like this in Chicago, especially not in the heart of Magnificent Mile. A studio apartment, ridiculously cheap for the area, tucked inside an old but well-maintained building. The leasing agent barely looked up from her desk when I signed the papers, and the previous tenant had left in a hurry. No explanation, just an empty space waiting to be filled. At first, I was too busy celebrating my luck to question it. Or prime location, a place of my own, and all within my student budget. It felt like I had won some cosmic lottery, but I should have known. Nothing that perfect comes without a price. The first time I heard it, I was half asleep. A whisper. My name, slipping through the air like a draft under the door. I told myself it was a dream, or maybe the neighbors through the thin walls. The second time, I was in the shower, barely audible under the rush of water, but distinct enough to make me turn off the faucet and listen. Emma. The sound came from the farthest corner of the apartment, where the light didn't quite reach. I stood there, shivering in the sudden silence, before shaking it off. Maybe I was stressed. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, something felt wrong. Days passed, and I tried to ignore it. The whispers never came when I was expecting them, only slipping into the quiet moments, just as I was drifting off to sleep or when I was alone and lost in thought. Always just a breath of sound, soft enough to doubt, but too real to ignore. I started keeping the TV on, filling the silence with news anchors and sitcom laugh tracks. It helped for a while, but then the whispers started coming from places they shouldn't. The closet, the bathroom mirror, the space beneath my bed. One night, I came home late from a study session and found my apartment wrong. The air was heavy, stagnant, like someone had been inside without opening a single window. I hesitated before stepping in, scanning the small space. Everything was where I had left it, except for one thing: my keys. I had tossed them onto the counter before leaving, but now they sat neatly in the middle of the coffee table. I stared at them, heart pounding. Maybe I had moved them without thinking. Maybe. But the feeling in the air, the way my skin prickled, as if unseen eyes were watching, it told me otherwise. I started locking my bedroom door at night. It felt ridiculous in a studio apartment. There was no real separation between the sleeping area and the rest of the space, but it gave me a fragile sense of control. Still, it didn't stop the whispers. If anything, they became bolder. No. Longer just my name, but fragments of sentences. Too quiet to fully understand. Some nights I swore I heard laughter. Not loud, not joyous, just a breathy chuckle, like someone amused at a private joke. One night, I woke up to the sound of breathing just outside my bedroom door. Slow, patient, waiting. The next morning, I called the landlord. I told him I was hearing things in the apartment, that maybe there was an issue with the vents or thin walls. He was silent for a moment before asking if I had spoken to the building's maintenance man. I hadn't. "Talk to him," the landlord said, his voice oddly distant. "He's been here a long time. He might know something." Then he hung up, leaving me gripping my phone with a growing sense of unease. I found the maintenance man that afternoon, an older man with deep-set eyes and a face that looked like it had seen too much. When I mentioned my apartment number, his expression tightened. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low and firm. My stomach nodded. "Why?" I asked, but I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if checking who might be listening. "The last guy, he heard things too. Voices, kept saying the place was calling. His name. Then one day he was gone, just vanished." He shook his head. "No note, no sign of where he went. Cops said he left on his own, but I don't think so." I wanted to laugh it off, call it urban legend nonsense, but I couldn't. Not when my nights were filled with whispers, with laughter that had no source. I swallowed hard. "Did anyone hear from him after?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The old man just looked at me, his silence heavier than any words. Then he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Get out," he said, again, this time almost pleading, "before it's too late." That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing. The maintenance man's warning echoed in my head, but moving out wasn't that simple. I didn't have the money for another place. And besides, what if it was just my imagination? Stress, exhaustion, paranoia. That's what I kept telling myself. But as the hours dragged on, the apartment felt different. The air was thick, pressing down on my chest like a heavy weight. I kept my eyes closed, trying to focus on my breathing. Slow, steady, just sleep, just Emma. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a scream, raw, guttural, and deafening, as if someone was right beside me, shrieking my name into my ear. My body jolted upright before my brain could even process what was happening. My pulse pounded as I scrambled for the lamp on my nightstand, my fingers shaking so badly I almost knocked it over. The light flickered on, and the apartment was still, empty. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper. The silence was too thick, as if the whole world had stopped just to listen. And then, the worst part. A slow knock at my closet door. I couldn't move. My breath hitched in my throat. My body frozen in place as the knock came again, soft, deliberate. Something was inside. Something had always been inside. My mind screamed at me to run, to throw open the door and escape, but my legs wouldn't work. And then, just as I finally forced myself to move, the closet door handle twisted. Not violently. Not in a rush. Just a slow, patient turn, as if whatever was inside knew I had nowhere to go. I choked back a sob, my back pressed against the wall. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The handle went still. The silence returned, but I knew better than to trust it. I don't remember how I made it out. I just remember running, my feet slamming against the hardwood as I threw, opened my apartment door and bolted into the hallway. I didn't stop. Not for my shoes, not for my bag, not for a second glance. I ran until I was outside, gasping for air in the cold Chicago night. I never went back. I never even broke my lease. The landlord didn't call. No one did. It was as if I had never lived there at all. And maybe that's how it works. Maybe that's why the rent was so cheap. The apartment doesn't need tenants. It just needs a name. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 5. The House That Stares Back, Los Angeles, CA, Hollywood Hills. I should have never gone inside. The mansion had been sitting there for decades, a relic of old Hollywood, tucked away behind rusted gates and ivy-choked walls. It was the kind of place that whispered its history through cracked windows and warped wooden floors. Perfect for content. A haunted house in the hills? That's viral gold. So I set up my gear, went live, and stepped through the front door. At first, it was just dust and silence. A grand chandelier hung like a skeletal relic above the main hall, its crystals dulled by time. My viewers climbed to the thousands within minutes, spamming fire emojis and daring me to go deeper. I walked through abandoned rooms, running commentary as I shined my flashlight on forgotten furniture and peeling wallpaper. Then, the comments started shifting. "Dude, check the mirror." "WTF is that?" "There's something behind you." I turned my phone toward the mirror in the grand hall. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, framed in tarnished gold, its glass warped with age. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. Just my own reflection staring back, the dim light of my flashlight bouncing off the surface. But the comments kept flooding in. "No, look closer." "Bro, there's eyes." My stomach twisted as I leaned in. The screen of my phone showed something I hadn't noticed before. 2 faint, glinting dots, deep in the reflection, watching. I spun around, aiming my flashlight into the cavernous hall behind me. Empty. The only sound was my own breath, suddenly too loud in the stillness. "You guys are messing with me," I muttered, forcing a laugh, but my fingers felt numb around the phone. I turned back to the mirror, expecting to see my own nervous expression. Instead, the eyes were closer. Not my eyes. Not human. They blinked. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. The chat was going insane now. "Dude, run! It moved! OMFG, what is that?" My pulse pounded in my ears, but I couldn't look away. The thing in the mirror wasn't just watching anymore. It was shifting. A shadowy form, its limbs too long, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. The surface of the mirror rippled, like water disturbed by a breath of wind. Then, it crawled forward. I screamed. The flashlight slipped from my grip, spinning, wildly as it hit the floor. The beam caught the mirror again, just in time to see a pale, clawed hand emerge from the warped glass. The fingers flexed, testing the air, as if the thing inside was adjusting to my world. My stream was still live. I could hear my viewers screaming in the comments, the frantic ping of notifications stacking up, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as the rest of its body began to pull itself free. The thing slithered out of the mirror, its body unfolding in jerky, unnatural movements. It had no distinct features, just a gaunt, elongated form. Its skin a shifting void that seemed to drink in the light. My breath caught in my throat as its head snapped toward me, though it had no eyes. Just hollow indentations where they should have been. And yet I knew it was looking at me. I scrambled backward, my phone shaking in my grip. The chat was a wall of frantic messages now. "Get out! It's real! Turn off the stream!" My own reflection remained frozen in the mirror, as if it were trapped on the other side. But the thing, it was here, with me. It took one step forward, then another, its limbs bending the wrong way, its fingers twitching like a puppet on invisible strings. And then, it smiled. The grin was too wide, stretching beyond where human lips should end. It wasn't just a smile. It was a gash across its face, too deep, too wrong. My stomach twisted as a low, wet clicking sound filled the air, like bones grinding together. My feet finally obeyed and I turned, bolting for the door. But the house didn't want me to leave. The front door, which had groaned open so easily when I arrived, now wouldn't budge. I yanked at the handle, slamming my shoulder into the wood. Nothing. Behind me, the clicking sound grew louder. My phone was still in my hand, still streaming, still showing that chat exploding with horror. Then my screen flickered. The video feed distorted, and for a split second I saw myself. But I wasn't alone. The thing was behind me. Its fingers stretched toward my shoulder. I spun around just as ice-cold fingers grazed my shirt. A choked scream ripped from my throat as I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. The thing was closer now, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its mouth still locked in that grotesque grin. It moved in sharp, disjointed motions, as if it was learning how to use its body. The lights in the house flickered, casting its silhouette in jagged, shifting shadows. My chat feed was a blur, people begging me to run, others convinced it was an elaborate prank. This isn't funny. Dude, what the hell? Is this real? But I didn't have time to answer. The thing lunged. I ducked on instinct, crashing into an antique table as its clawed hand sliced through the air where my head had been. My breath came in ragged gasps as I crawled backward, my only thought, I have to get out. My phone slipped from my grasp as I scrambled to my feet. The screen flickered, distorting the feed, but for a brief moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was no longer in the frame. Only the thing remained, staring at the camera, its grin widening as if it knew something I didn't. My own reflection, my presence in that digital space, gone. It wasn't just stepping out of the mirror, it was replacing me. The last thing my viewers saw was the feed cutting to black. I don't remember what happened next. The next morning my phone was found outside the mansion, screen cracked, battery dead. No one has seen me since. No new posts, no live streams, just an account frozen in time. And sometimes when people rewatch that last video, they swear. Right. Before the screen goes dark, they see something else staring back. If you've seen that video, tell me, did you notice it too? The eyes in the mirror, the way the thing moved? Some people say it was just a glitch, a hoax, another internet mystery. But I know the truth. He never came back. And if you ever find yourself alone in front of a mirror, make sure you're the only one staring back.